Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In this episode of Horns, we hear from Charles Edel, the inaugural chair of the Australia Studies program at CSIS in Washington, D.C. Edel outlines America's interests in the Asia-Pacific region, focusing on economic and security questions, and points out that these interests have long endured throughout America's history. In his talk, he addresses what large questions remain unanswered specifically related to China, as well as how the Biden administration is hoping to answer them and what we might expect from the future in U.S. Chinese relationships. This talk is a fascinating and broad historical sweep of U.S. Chinese and U.S. Asian relationships and demonstrates why the recent quote-unquote pivot to the Asia-Pacific is in fact a consistent move to pursue America's economic and security interests in the world. This talk was given at the Clements Center Summer Seminar for History and Statecraft in Beaver Creek, Colorado. Let's listen in.
For my father's generation, I guess probably for the grandfather's generation of a lot of you here, often, you talk to a guy, you say, how'd you meet that friend of yours? You say, we met in Vietnam. We were in a foxhole together in Vietnam. I didn't meet Charlie in Vietnam, but I met him in a Vietnamese restaurant. So, all right, so a hole-in-the-wall Vietnamese restaurant in Seven Corners, Virginia, about 20 years ago. I just started at the State Department, and he was looking at different doctoral programs at the time, and a good mutual friend put us together and said, trust me, you guys are going to like each other. And he was right. And so this was the start of a great, now 2-decade-long friendship where Charlie has had quite a series of adventures. I mean, just sit down and get his life and career story if you want to hear about kind of a great model of integrating academic work and policy and think tanking and globetrotting and all of that, being a pretty good husband and father along the way. But for our purposes, he's worked in the State Department's policy planning staff, handling Asia there. He has worked in Beijing. He's most recently been in Australia the last few years, and is now the holder and master czar and commander of the inaugural Australia chair at CSIS, the great think tank in Washington, D.C. And as he was telling me earlier, I didn't realize this, but there are only 2 dedicated Australia study entities in the United States, one of which is the Australia chair that he holds there at CSIS, and the other is the Australia Study Center at the University of Texas in Austin. So anyway, go figure. So among other things that bring us together. So anyway, but Charlie's also a veteran of many previous summers at Beaver Creek and is always one of our perennials to be sure we bring back. And he has the challenging task of following Dr. Shockey. So anyway, and being our last speaker of the evening. But trust me, it will be worth the wait. So Charlie, come on up. Where are you going to hear from you?
Thank you, Will. I'm really excited because after 7 years, I think this is the first year that I don't have to invent an entirely new talk on an entirely new subject. So in conversation with Dan, we've made a joint decision here. You have all been very diligent and have sat through many talks here today. And so now, anytime I say China, you're all going to have a shot. And I'll try to say it as many times as possible during this talk. When Elizabeth was asking me for a talk, I suggested the storm center of the world has shifted, the past, present, and future of U.S. policy towards the Indo-Pacific. Now, everyone here might have thought that this was going to be a lecture or a talk or obviously pearls of wisdom that are thrown your way, but it's not. In fact, this is going to be a quiz to make sure that everyone is awake. So let me start with the first question for our assembled audience, both here and in the room and eventually online, I guess, too. Any guesses whom was the author of that quote? Whom said the storm center of the world? Who is the author of that quote? Any guesses? Storm center of the world has shifted. Will, you should be jumping out of your seat because it was John Hay. Okay, next question for all of you. The storm center of the world has shifted to where?
Do you have any non-obscure questions?
Look, my friend, we could go straight to John Quincy Adams, so consider yourself lucky that we're starting in the 19th century. Storm center to China, specifically. Shot. Now, and last question for you. At what point was this said, that the storm center of the world has shifted to China?
1898.
brilliant. Well, I already said John Hay, right? So you got that. So 1899. So it was John Hay, who was Secretary of State, who said in 1899 that the storm center of the world has shifted to China, and he added that whomever understands that mighty empire has a key to world politics for the next 5 centuries. And here we are nearly a century and a quarter later, and we're still trying to figure out China and thinking that what goes on in Asia or the Asia Pacific or the Indo-Pacific, as we now call it, will hold the key to our policy decisions for the next decades, if not the next couple of centuries. Enough of the quiz. I actually want to shift to that storm center of the world, and I want to take this talk in 3 different parts. The first, understanding how we got to the current moment that we find ourselves in. Second, taking a look at some of the unfolding contours of the Biden administration's approach to the Indo-Pacific. And then third, projecting forward a bit to think about where we're heading and critically which big questions we've not yet managed to answer. But let me start with the caveat before I get to any of that. My thoughts tonight are going to be intently focused on Asia generally and China specifically, and not focused on Russia, and not focused on Saudi Arabia. And I think that's fine for the purposes of this talk. But for current policy, it should go without stating that this is a myopic approach, right? Where you can kind of put blinders on the rest of the world. And you can't, after all, say that we must focus on China to the exclusion of everything else in the world when we are in the midst of a war in Europe where the United States is playing a leading, if supporting, role of what's going on there. And I say that because U.S. strategy in the form of the national security strategy, which Tanvi and Sheena are going to talk about tomorrow morning, was written a while ago. And then the White House decided that it had to claw back what it had already written so that it actually reflected real world events. And that's what they're doing right now. So while I'm speaking, I'm going to focus on China. But I do hope that when we get to Q&A, when we get to discussion, we can draw Ukraine into the conversation, or we can draw that fist bump with MBS into the conversation. We can talk about kind of the role of partisan politics, all of that which has a necessary effect on U.S. politics and policy towards the Indo-Pacific. All right, so how did we get here in the first place? Or why did we get here in the first place? Now, for those of you who do not obsessively follow the geopolitical machinations in the Indo-Pacific region, and even for those of us who do, the speed with which the shift in U.S. policy towards China came towards a more assertive, more forward-leaning, some would say a much more hawkish policy towards China, seemingly occurred overnight. Moreover, it seems, and here I'm talking specifically about the U.S.-China relations, that it's a conversation that crowds out every other policy conversation that we have. And why did this happen? How did this happen? And at a deeper and perhaps somewhat more abstract level of questioning, what is there about China? What is there about the PRC? What is there about the CCP that has such a triggering effect on Americans? And Tommy, I know I said this last year, but a slightly less high-minded way of putting this is if you think about Mean Girls, and when you're thinking about geopolitics, and if you follow Tomvi's wonderful social media output, you should think about Mean Girls. What is it about China that makes the United States just so obsessed with it? And I would say, first of all, that this is not a new obsession. This is a very, very old obsession that reaches back to the very founding of the Republic. Now, at a time when many have wondered and asked about the United States' staying power in the Western Pacific, it's a useful history reminder to remember that the United States has been a Pacific power for the entirety of its history. And it's always seen its economic fortunes, its political influence, and its security intimately wrapped up in that part of the world. From the earliest days of the Republic to our current moment, America has had an abiding fascination with, deep commercial ties to, and grave security concerns about Asia. And this dates back to the 1780s, when America started sending commercial ships to China. And we did that as an exact reaction to what the British were doing to us in Europe and the rest of the world. That is, closing their ports to us because we had beaten them. So we were looking for other areas. And it was actually a pretty successful policy. We broke the monopoly of the East India Company's tea trade with us. And by the time you hit the Constitutional Convention, if you begin to look at the numbers, a seventh of American commerce is going to Asia at this point. But if it's commerce that initiates America's interest in Asia, it was soon followed by, or rather augmented by, values-based diplomacy. That's modern terminology. We'll just say missionary work at the time, and power in the form of a permanent naval and expanded diplomatic presence in and across the Pacific. And in the long sweep of American history, historical ties to this important region have evinced, I think, a persistent and underlying logic that can be boiled down to two things that we're trying to achieve. Number one, this logic demands access for the United States to Asia for commerce and for the penetration of our ideas. And simultaneously, this access is meant to prevent threats from emerging in Asia that can threaten American shores. That is the focal point of American grand strategy from the beginning to this day, I would argue. So I would just say that we've been thinking about and engaged with the entire region for a very long time. Now, that's interesting and somewhat useful history, but it doesn't necessarily tell us why the United States has become so focused so quickly and so compulsively on China at this particular moment. And to talk of Asia today is to talk about China. To answer that question, I'd like to propose to you 5 different theories that are different but somewhat overlapping, some of which are more theoretical than others, but which doesn't make any of them all that less truthy. So I'm going to throw out 5 theories for you. Keep note of them because I welcome additions, subtractions, and debate of them as we get further along. So first, I'm using this corporately and nationally, feelings about spheres of influence. For over 2 centuries, Americans have generally opposed the idea of a world divided into rival spheres of influence. And Americans have always worked, and frequently quite successfully, to deny other powers their own sphere of influence. Now, there's always been something ambivalent, and critics would say hypocritical, about how Americans think about this point. Because Americans have not liked the idea of a world divided into spheres of influence, except, of course, if it's our own. And whether it's in the economic, the technological, the diplomatic, or the military realm, there's little doubt that today what China is attempting to do is establish an exclusive sphere of influence. What is debatable, though, I would say, is how far that sphere of influence is bound to extend. So, second proposition for you. The second reason that Americans have issues with China is that we don't, as a matter of principle, very much like authoritarian regimes. Now, I'm going to start with the high one, then we'll get to all the caveats about this as well. From the outset, there has been a prominent strain in American thinking that runs through American political thought that has understood the country to be locked in a competition for influence with authoritarian rivals. Now, the challenge has taken different forms at different times, and it's gone by different names, right? Think about this. In the 18th century, Americans were warned of the dangers of monarchy, of tyranny, and of despotism. In the 20th century, it was autocratic regimes, fascism, and totalitarianism. And now, in political debate, we hear American planning increasingly focused on struggles with and against authoritarian actors. Now, such antipathy, I would argue, has served as perhaps the most important and most consistent feature of America's relationship with the world, even as the nature and the nomenclature of that challenge has changed. Now, none of that, right? This is a pretty large claim that I've just set out for you. None of that is to suggest that American opposition to authoritarian regimes has been perfectly consistent. It has, of course, not been. And yet, the clearest thread, I think, that runs through America's response to authoritarian regimes has been opposition, sometimes muted, generally explicit, and often hostile, coupled with an abiding belief that democratic systems are better at promoting social stability, prosperity, and security. As China is a giant authoritarian competitor, it is bound to produce antagonism in the American body politic. Third proposition for you, which I've already laid out for you, the bigness of the challenge. The giant nature of China's challenge really is the reason that America has issues with China. As much as it is the nature of the challenge, it's the scale of what many Americans perceive to be the threat. China is huge and its resources are vast. Not, of course, inexhaustible, but sufficiently large and sufficiently concentrated to pose a very large challenge. And in this bigness, there is something inherently enticing and alarming. Fourth proposition for you. Anxiety about the trajectory of American history. Now, the size of China and the scale of the China challenge also raises challenging questions about the trajectory of American and indeed global history. The U.S. narrative is that the world, often led by the U.S., consistently, if unevenly, moves towards progress, innovation, and democracy. Now, China and the fact of China and China's growing power in the world holds out the possibility that the trajectory will bend in a very different and, to an American perspective, very wrong trajectory. All of this, I would say, is causing many Americans to engage in anxious extrapolation about the future and what this might mean for and to American identity and its role in the world. Which leads finally to politics and really to policy, or perhaps more accurately, towards a focus on policy failure. This is most prominently expressed, I think, in the idea, and I know, Martina, you're writing your dissertation on this, so you can hop up here and say it for me if you want to, but expressing the idea of the end of engagement, right? Engagement being the assumption that started with Kissinger and Nixon and really persisted right up to 2016, that as China interacted more with the West and more with the United States, it would mellow its hard edges and become more like us. This was expressed, I think, most clearly in Kurt Campbell and Eli Ratner's Foreign Affairs article in 2018, The China Reckoning. They concluded that, and I'm going to quote them here, all sides of the policy debate erred. Engagement with China did not make it more economically or politically open, nor had it deterred Beijing from working to displace core components of a US-led system. Now, if this reckoning has occurred in the policy community, a different reckoning of sorts is running through our political communities, because for the last several years, and I would argue for the next many years, to a greater or a lesser extent, both parties now see electoral advantage in being tough on China and making sure that they are tougher than their opponents. Okay, fine. All of those are deep themes, which brings us to the search of what a new policy might begin to look like. Now, here I'd like to lay out what I think the Biden administration has said it would do and assess what it all adds up to. Look at whether or not there's been strategic coherence in what it's trying to pursue, and see what tensions exist in their policies before getting into a conversation. So on policy, if you look at the public pronouncements from the campaign straight into the Senate hearings of all the principal players, I think you get a pretty clear picture of the administration's inclinations towards the Indo-Pacific. And I'll just make sure that I quote these to get this accurately. At his confirmation hearing to be Secretary of State, Tony Blinken told the Senate that there was, quote, no doubt that China posed the most significant challenge to the United States of any nation. Lloyd Austin, who we were talking about during Kari's discussion, stated that globally, I understand that Asia must be the focus of our efforts, and I see China in particular as the pacing challenge for our department. Jake Sullivan said the U.S. needed to impose costs on China for what it was doing in Xinjiang, in Hong Kong, and Taiwan. And during confirmation hearings, Bill Burns said that, quote, an adversarial predatory Chinese leadership poses our biggest geopolitical test and would shape his approach to intelligence collection. Now, as if to underscore all this, in his speech to the Munich Security Conference last year, President Biden said, we must prepare together for a long-term strategic competition with China. Competition with China is going to be stiff. That's what I expect, and that's what I welcome. At another point, I believe he also described it as extreme competition. So the adverbs are really on fire here. Now, he urged the U.S. and its allies to push back against Beijing's economic abuses and coercion, to play a leading role in shaping some of the governing technology that we use, and to defend democracy against those who would normalize repression. Now, whether at defense, at state, at the NSC, or the CIA, or the White House, the message, I think, has been pretty consistently clear. Competition is the theme. The Indo-Pacific region is the focus, and that competition extends to just about every field of endeavor. Now, that inclination from the outset yielded several bureaucratic and policy implications, including restructuring the NSC to make it very Indo-Pacific heavy, choosing Asia experts early to staff all the major departments and agencies, rejoining international institutions like the WHO so that there would be competition for leadership as opposed to walking away from it, making it clear that the United States sees its relationship with China primarily through the lens of competition, also making it clear that coordination with allies would take precedence over talking to China, see the Quad, and a premium would be placed on joint responses and collective action to counter China's trade and technological abuses, which is to say that they've done and they are doing a lot. The question, though, I don't think is whether they're doing things. The better question is whether there's a logic behind what they are doing and what it all might amount to. And from my perspective, the logic, I think, is very clear, both overall and regionally, and we've had multiple indications of it. But even if you look at particular policies, they might obscure the larger vision, which is also quite clear, and which Jim began to alluding to in his talk earlier today. Because according to President Biden, every single time he gets a microphone, you'll hear it from him, the defining feature of international relations in the 21st century is competition between democratic states and authoritarian regimes. For the most part, if you look at his interactions, certainly his early interactions with foreign leaders, this is what he meant to stress, whether or not it's with the Quad, whether it's with European leaders. And he had told reporters that the United States was in a contest with, quote, autocratic governments around the world as to whether or not democracies can compete with them in a rapidly changing 21st century. So I would say that the emerging contours, even as administration officials attempt to dial it down occasionally, is a vision of intense competition between democracies and authoritarian actors. Now, that has several implications to it. A sustained focus on competition, a belief that that competition extends to every endeavor, and it also means much more focus on allies and multilateral institutions, which are the locus of that competition. What's less clear, though, is how this all shakes out in budgetary terms, on what timeline the administration is acting on, and critically, the degree of buy-in from allies and partners. Concluding, I'll make a couple of thoughts about the emerging contours of a strategy of gearing the United States up for a long-term and perhaps, in President Biden's words, extreme competition with authoritarian states, China chief among them. Now, let me be candid. I tend to think that this is the best possible approach to the challenges that we're seeing, but one which nevertheless has challenges that are inherent in it. So framing America's major challenge as largely ideological works better for some audiences than it does for others. Of course, Allies are reassured, most allies, I should say, are reassured that Biden, a committed internationalist who believes in the rules-based order, is president and not Trump. But the devil, of course, is in the details about whether or not America can forge real agreements on data, on climate, and on the white whale of American politics, trade, that are actually useful to allies as well. Resources also matter in this competition. That point often manifests itself in the question of whether domestic or foreign policies are going to take pride of place for the administration. And there are, of course, linked, right? Investments that you can make at home can make you more competitive abroad, as the administration will tell you over and over again. But there are, of course, other areas where the trade-offs are a little bit more stark, where if you want to focus on economic and technological competition, you are by necessity going to have less to put into the military kitting. And so those are some of the policy questions and I think rubs and tensions that we have. But this is the Clements Center, so I want to zoom out for a little bit at the end of our talk and actually talk about some of the bigger strategic questions that are still in front of us. Because if you're interested in this subject and if you're interested in this region, I think this is where all the interesting work is going to be done and play out over the next several years. One of the things that Corey said a couple of years ago, which has stuck with me, is that if you want to have a really interesting doctoral thesis, book, and really career, you have to pick really interesting questions that are going to animate you as you drive forward, whether or not you have the perfect answers and solutions to them. So let me throw out a couple of what I think are really big questions about this unfolding competition. So first, will America continue to be willing to play the role that it has played in the past? Now, in 2016, Pew Research found that 57% of Americans believe that the United States should mind its own business internationally and let other countries get along as best as they can. That result revealed some of the most pronounced anti-internationalist sentiment in the U.S. in generations and suggested that Americans are increasingly focused on tending to their own affairs and not the world's. And yet, when you ask Americans if they support U.S. alliances, if they support trade, and if they want Washington to possess the world's strongest military, the answer is also yes, and often by a considerable margin. What I would say that this data tells us is not that Americans are resistant to this, but they're a little bit more conflicted about what these choices might pertain. And I think the base question that we have to ask is, of the United States, will we or won't we? To what extent and under what conditions? Because those are the foundational questions from which everything else flows. Second, the second big question, and someone's doing a dissertation on this, who's doing it on escalation dynamics? Okay. This is whether responding to aggressions leads to escalation spirals or deterrence, right? I have a decided view of this. It generally inclines towards the latter, but this is a debate. And it's sometimes explicit, more often than not, it's an implicit debate, and it oftentimes guides policymakers about what they think is allowable, feasible, and wise. So please hurry up, finish your dissertation, Daniel, and you can help guide that conversation. Third, how does the U.S. regain leverage? Does this come from just renewal at the domestic sense? Does it come on the international level? Is it through playing a better set of defense or going on the offensive? And if you're going on the offensive, is that across the board or just in select areas? Those questions I don't think have been answered, although many policymakers and politicians alike are on a constant search, as well they should be, for what gives the United States leverage in the international system. Fourth, many of our friends and partners in Southeast Asia will continue to remain hesitant and won't want to pick sides. India inevitably moves slower than the United States would like it to, and yet I do think that the general trend of where the United States in Asia is headed is perfectly clear. The real question, I think, is whether or not we're moving fast enough to make a difference, whether we're doing enough things to produce a useful outcome, whether we're moving in the right areas, i.e. not just in the military space, and whether or not our actions are sufficiently coordinated with others to result in efforts that are larger than the sum of its parts. Final question for all of you, or all of us, is what exactly do alliances look like in the future? Are allies and partners willing to fund and provide for more of their own defense? And I would say that the old deal, that America would provide security in exchange for basing rights and increased influence, is no longer sustainable given shifts in the international balance of power. So how do alliances evolve? And partially this is a conceptual question. What fields do they need to grow into? And partially this is a set of as of yet unanswered questions about whether or not frontline states can increasingly provide security for themselves and the United States in addition to the United States providing their own security. So there you go, 200 years of history in a pop.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.